Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game Battle Report. Today we are playing Vanilla O-12 versus Vanilla PanOceania, and the scenario is B-Pong. Now for this game I am playing a slightly revised version of my 80% of gamblers list, where I am chickening out very slightly and limiting myself to just one Razor mine layer. That's the monofilament mines mine layer profile that I'm on a consistent quest to try and get literally any kills with the mines with at all. But we've bowed to reality a little bit in this case with just the one Razor, but then we have one Razor forward observer, and this is a profile that I also wanted to make use of, basically just in O12 generally, because even though, yes, the mine layer has mine layer monofilament mines, the fact of the matter is both of them have boarding shotgun +1 bursts, ballistic skill 12, mimetism -6, camo marker. Like, that is still a great close assault piece, regardless of whether or not you're attempting to make use of those monofilament mines. And the forward observer is a forward observer, which is relevant in some scenarios these days. But it also has decharges, and just being able to make close assaults with that weapon and those visual modifiers, etc., that's just generally pretty powerful. So we're starting off with two Razors, but in this case just one mine layer and one forward observer, and then we're building out into the same shell as before around that, but the version that was featured on this channel in the lists that I've liked in N5 video had two robot paramedics. In this case, we've just trimmed and tucked down to one robot paramedic in order to get just a little bit of hacking into the list to make it a bit more well-rounded. So from the top, we have the Gamma HMG in this case. I think the Feuerback is probably a slightly more well-rounded option, but I was able to upgrade to the HMG in this list just for the joy of throwing 6 dice in as part of a ballistic skill attack. But then he's accompanied, as before, by 2 Vidocs for fire team bonuses, one of whom is a doctor. We then have a single robot paramedic, a single Varangian in group 1, there's another one in group 2 for smoke, our 2 Razors, the first of 2 Moonrakers just to pad out the midfield with some more camouflage markers. These guys are still very good value at 15 points half an SWC. And then a Kappa Hacker. Now this is going to be our only regular hacker in the list, but even having just one regular hacker is a lot more than none. We'll actually see this in the PanOceanian list that we're going to be playing against today. Neither of these lists are hacking heavy, but both of them just splash a little bit of hacking in, which turns repeaters into both offensive and defensive threats. It just even a single hacker and any ability to put out repeaters opens up lists to have options that otherwise wouldn't exist. We've then got a single war correspondent, 3 points, it's the only irregular in the list, and it frees up points to do a bunch of other stuff. Then in combat group 2, an Epsilon HMG, our second notable gunfighting element. He is very single wound. We may have to, for example, use Speedball to bring him back at some point during the game, because he's not guaranteed to be able to play near the Vidoc Doctor, for example. You do hope to reconstitute him if he goes down, but single wound really can go all the way to dead quite easily. But in active turn, very dangerous. We then have a Cyber Ghost Killer Hacker with Pitcher. And this is sort of the second part of our very, very lightweight hacking package. This is by no means like elite hacking, but we have a single pitcher, a single decent quality killer hacker, and a single average quality regular hacker. That is super, super entry level, but entry-level hacking is still a great deal more than no hacking, which is what the previous version of this list had. We've then got our second Varangian, a Ment Officer, just for chain of command since we will be getting aggro with the Gamma Lieutenant, and then our second Moonraker. So overall, even though this list is still trying to do things with, for example, the Razor Mine Layer, it's widened itself out a little bit to have more capability, a bit more in the way of specialists. It's a bit more generic. Now, generic lists are actually not necessarily what you want for a scenario like B-Pong, but we rolled B-Pong up randomly as part of regular Wednesday night games. And while B-Pong is a scenario I would actually rather specialize in, especially if I had the prospect of going first, this is well-rounded enough to be able to play it, and so I felt fine about that. Our goals for the game, I mean, in the first instance, obviously, are just to win, but then secondly, to see how much work we can get out of either or both of the Razors. Boarding shotgun +1 bursts, as I've previously noted, have become kind of like a favorite in terms of weapon options in N5, and so we were going to really test and see how much work we could get out of either or both of these Razor profiles over the course of the game. And we would have our work cut out for us because we would be playing against this PanOceanian list. Now, for anyone who follows the Australian Infinity tournament scene, this list might be familiar. This is the primary list that Jordan took to Border Bash in Albury a couple of weeks ago at time of recording, maybe a little longer. And it was the list that he used for much of the event, which he came first in. Now, Border Bash was an event with a very demanding scenario mix, but I think despite that, Jordan has had to make very few concessions with either of his lists. And this one especially is genuinely fearsome. This is one of the best Panoceanian lists I have seen out of the edition in terms of what it is able to fit in and the number of bases that it is able to cover. And while there are some like tinkerings that you could absolutely make with it, if you weren't trying specifically to accommodate all of the demands of the Border Bash mission mix, even just played absolutely as is, this list does a tremendous amount of work. So from top to bottom, we have a 3-person fire team Haris consisting of Joan of Arc and 2 Helot FTOs. Now, Joan is the mobility version, which makes her very slightly less durable, but she is still a 2 wound, no wound in cap heavy infantry. And that will be a burst 4 plus 1 special die AP Spitfire at ballistic skill 15, so a fearsome gunfighter. But then the 2 Helots especially are just wonderfully terrifying. There were just barely points in SWC in the list to upgrade a more generic Helot, right, from say a marksman rifle into a Red Fury, and that Red Fury is rolling 5 dice in ARO. That's just an obscene number of dice to throw back at someone in your reactive turn, and the odds just of critting, if nothing else, become like surprisingly high when you have that many dice. It is genuinely difficult to put either of these helots down, but especially the Red Fury, which has got relatively forgiving range bands. Its -3 range band persists for a really long time. It's good out to 24 inches. Like, these are just really, really cool. Now, you do, to keep the +1 special die, you do need to have both helots, and inevitably at some point during the game, one or both are going to go down. Ideally, they sell their lives at a high price, but just these become regular orders because Joan is an inspiring leadership lieutenant. This is just a cool little package of value. And as much as, like, yes, camouflage helots do have certain advantages, right? The fact that you have to discover a camouflage helot makes them a better defensive piece because you have that guaranteed order of insulation, the chance of failure as your opponent has to sustain, like dealing with the possibility of rolling a fail on discovery roll, right? If you are looking purely for defense, yes, camouflage helots are a little bit more consistent, but the fact of the matter is that these things are firstly throwing extra dice in ARO, but secondly, they are contributing to Joan's offense in the active turn. Taking her from burst 4 to burst 4 plus 1 special die isn't insignificant either, and she can draw these helots up the field with her for as long as she needs to if she's going on the offense. Now, that's just the first 3 models. The 4th model in the list is a goddamn Swiss Guard. Now, this is something that I feel like everyone does intellectually know is really, really good, but I just haven't seen a tremendous amount of people play at all in N5 in PanOceania. Now, to be fair, it's obviously only in a single army. It's only in generic PanOceania, and it is competing with some very high quality tactical armored gears for space as a primary gunfighter, but it's ballistic skill 15, armor 5, thermoptic camouflage, so camouflage mimetism -6 with hidden deployment. It is just an absolute apex gunfighter, and while you can make the argument that, okay, look, it's going to struggle to try and really put a ton of wounds into an enemy like armor 8 tag, in this list, you have 5 dice out of Joan to do that if you need to, and so the Swiss Guard is free to do what it really wants to do, which is just punch down really hard into any just generic ARO pieces that your opponent is putting out on Overwatch. In a mirror match, for example, if this list played against itself, the Swiss Guard is an excellent piece at threatening these helots because it just stacks modifiers and incredible ballistic skill and burst, and frankly, at only 56 points, it's a steal. We then have 2 Fugazi drone bots and a specialist operative Teutonic Knight. The Teuton is just really nice value at 19 points. He is not really, I would say, not really a concession to the Border Bash scenarios, but does fit quite well as a general specialist and fight and be annoying piece in Panoceanian lists. He is impetuous. Now, he has limited cover. That's not the end of the world. Good melee, but also a good piece in scenarios, for example, like B-Pong, where you want a model that can move forward, control one of the objectives in the game, whether it is the Pong or one of the antennas, and be just a little bit more difficult than your opponent would like to remove. We then have a Killer Hacker Banshee. Cheap, effective, good quality. N5 is an edition where rules like combat jump are not too terribly costed, and so at 23 points, a Banshee is very affordable. Magistrate Chain of Command, you do kind of want Chain of Command in this list. It still sucks if Joan goes down because there are a lot of irregulars that she is turning regular, but by having Chain of Command and counterintelligence on the Magistrate, you go from it is catastrophic for Joan to die or get isolated to, yeah, it's kind of bad for Joan to die or get isolated, but not the end of the world. Chain of Command especially makes turn one plays from your opponent attempting to do things like Oblivion Zone, a non-catastrophic game state, and so just kind of a necessary tax, but you're getting counterintelligence and a specialist operative for the price point, so it's really not too bad. We then have, and this is a point that you could change in other versions of this list, we have a Kahu duo. We've got the paramedic Kahu and then the Kahu Feuerback +1 burst. Now these are pieces that could actually quite easily become bolts in a different version of the list. The choice between bolts and Kahu is a little bit personal preference in terms of what you want from your gunfighting elements, from your ranged pieces, from your specialists. The main thing is that a bolt sniper compared to a Kahu Feuerback, that really can go either way. The damage output of the Feuerback, the mimetism of the Kahu is nice, but the marksmanship of the bolt is also exceptional. The main thing is that the specialist profiles you get in bolts are a bit more variable. Yes, there's a paramedic, but there are also chain of command bolts, which would free up the magistrate slot, and there's a killer hacker and hacker bolt profile, both of which are good as well. This list spreads itself fairly thin in terms of stuff like hacking. It pays 21 points for magistrate chain of command, so you can do stuff if you exchange these for bolts that just offer a little bit of flexibility in terms of other pieces that are available in the list. But for the border bash scenarios, the options that the Kahu presented in terms of things like their maneuverability, their ability to move up the field, which bolts don't have quite as much, Kahu were the better pick for border bash, and they're being played in this game tonight because this is just using Jordan's list. One of my locals picked it up, and credit to him. Finally, rounding out the list, we have a bunch of good cheap stuff. We've got a war correspondent who is regular in a list led by Joan, a motorized bounty hunter, 9 points, good quality assault element, was a major overperformer for Jordan at Border Bash, although there was some dice involved in that. In fact, the motorized bounty hunter was so much of an overperformer that there's almost an argument that the final round was, you could be call it a little bit anticlimactic because of how well the motorized bounty hunter performed, although I do think that would be inaccurate because I strongly suspect that Jordan was in fact climaxing by the time the bounty hunter made the 17th armor roll. We've then got just a pair of Fennecs, and these guys are super high value for fairly low points cost. We have a Fennec hacker, much like my list, this is the regular hacker that's just doing the thing of, hey, one hacker is a great deal more than zero. One hacker that brings its own repeater projection to the list just lets you do things that otherwise would be impossible. Lets you set up defenses that otherwise you would not be able to enact. It makes the Fugazi drone bots much more live. And if we look at the matchup between this and the O-12 list that I'll be playing, the fact that there are two Fugazi drone bots and a single Fennec hacker, even though all of those are just there, the Fugazi drone bots are just there to be order generators primarily. The fact that they are deployment zone repeaters and there is a Fennec hacker means that until I neutralize that Fennec hacker, I kind of can't do things like attack with the roadbot. Yes, the Fennec is only willpower 12, but I am not risking a roadbot getting bricked as it approaches my opponent's deployment zone off of that 60% chance to hit multiplied by the chance for me to pass both of, or pass or to fail my defense rolls. And so just like a single hacker makes a really big difference to how a list can perform offensively and defensively, and so the Fennec is there for that. Similarly, we've got another high utility Fennec piece rounding out the list, and this is the Forward Observer. Now, Forward Observer is a specialist role that is more high value than it used to be, but the main thing that's really good about this guy is just the disco balls. Now, he doesn't have link bonuses, but you can still fire off both shots on 15s, hoping to hit one. That's pretty high reliability. And there are lots and lots of cases in any given game where just being able to fire off and create an eclipse zone on turn 3 as you approach an objective, for example, is very high value. For 13 points, the Fennec, particularly Fennec Forward Observer, is something I usually would try not to leave home without in any PanOceanian or Kestrel Colonial Force list, just because having that option at any point during the game to play in a non-Pan-Oceanian way, notwithstanding the list name, right, my religion is gun, the fact that you can, as Pan-Oceania, block visibility once per game with very high reliability is just really useful. So overall, this is an outstanding list. It's well-rounded, it has 3 really good quality gun pieces, it has some excellent defenses, it has close assault, like multiple solid close assault elements. And if you want to tinker with it, it has room to flex as well. This is one of the best Pan-Oceanian lists I have seen in N5, both on its own merits and as a platform for future iterations. And so significant credit to Jordan for generating this, testing it, and then running it to victory at Border Bash. Very well deserved. Now, on to the game, and a quick note about the scenario and how we've set it up before we move on to how the game actually played out. B-Pong is a scenario that was kind of maligned when it first debuted, but it is now in its second iteration And while it's a very different scenario, it is one that I find interesting and well worth playing. In its current iteration, it's much more like almost an equivalent to acquisition, in the same way that like supremacy is a scoring across the whole round version of quadrant control. B-Pong actually plays a lot like a scoring across the whole game version of acquisition. Now, there are a bunch of differences. You can only score one of the consoles per round, etc. But the fact that you have to push models forward and put them at risk and put them in the midfield and try and survive there makes it a scenario where you have to treat the scenario as very live and kind of high cost in terms of potential casualties, basically the entire game. That makes it a really aggressive kind of like rhythm scenario where both players have to attack and do damage, but in a way that is very sort of specific toward accomplishing your scenario objectives. You can't just unga bunga into your opponent. And when I talked before about how I think B-Pong is a scenario that you want a plan for, I think it's specifically a scenario that you want to plan for if you are going first. Because all of the scoring happens at the end of each round, and because you're trying to push models into the midfield and put them adjacent to at least one of the consoles and the B-Pong itself, that puts models at significant risk. And because of that, I think the plan that most lists would want to pursue if they are going first in this kind of scenario is either, okay, I'm just going to be incredibly aggressive, I'm going to do a ton of damage to my opponent, I will start scoring from turn 2. That is a way that you can approach, for example, supremacy. Or you can approach it kind of the way that you might approach a mission like Armory, where you build a fort kick-ass in the midfield and make it really challenging for your opponent to attack into that. So things, for example, like some Toha lists, who can shove just a ton of material into kind of like a singular defensive cordon and use stuff like zero visibility zones in ARO and mines and other kind of stuff to hold territory in the midfield. That's the kind of thing that can be really useful if you suspect you will have to go first in B-Pong. Frankly, much of the time, it's just better to go second in this scenario. The scoring is much, much easier, right? It's much easier to play from second turn because you can just pounce on whatever your opponent has put, particularly in contact with the Pong, annihilate that, put an expendable piece in contact with the Pong yourself, and just do that turn after turn. Now, you will have to accommodate, like you have to account for that final little bit of end of game scoring with whose side of the table is the Pong in. Their opponent will get points for doing that. But 6 out of 10 of the points in the scenario can be accomplished by just having a model in base contact with an antenna and a model in base contact with the Pong at the end of each round, and it's much easier for the second player to accomplish that. Now, for that reason, one of the things I recommend for this scenario is to always use a three-dimensional terrain piece at minimum for the B-Pong itself. If you use a three-dimensional marker, you treat it as if it were cover, and that gives the player going first at least a chance to have something dug in behind the Pong and may be able to survive. Now, I say maybe because there are multiple ways of moving the Pong in this scenario. Both the antennas and the Pong itself can be moved by special, like the antennas allow you to move the Pong itself can be moved by a specialist, which means that even if you use a three-dimensional terrain piece as the B-Pong so that you can take cover behind it, well, it can move. So that will only do you so much good, but I do strongly recommend that. Don't just use a two-dimensional marker for it, even though it is legal to do so under the scenario, because a two-dimensional marker just means that a model touching it is often not going to be in cover, period. And for the player going first, that means trying to contest this for most of the game is a death sentence. So just to make it a little bit more even, I'm totally fine, is a general rule, with scenarios that favor going second, but just to add a little bit of balance to this scenario, that's my recommendation. And I mention that because we get into the game, we make the lieutenant roll, and my opponent crits on a 15, and Snap picks deployment, and after a little bit of thinking, deploys on the right side of the table. Now, I do have the option of being like, okay, cool, I will just hard go second, but I am not quite game to do that, particularly because my opponent has said, oh yeah, I'm just trying out that list that won Border Bash. And I was like, okay, I think I know what's in that list, and it's terrifying. Okay, I cannot afford to just let that go first off of a deployment advantage, so we're going to do this the hard way. So I am going to be going first. I will also be deploying first on the left side of the table. And so we go about setting everything up. Now, just in terms of classifieds, my two classifieds are capture, which I will not accomplish this game. I'll secure the HVT instead, and telemetry, which is an example of one of those things that you get to just be able to do much more easily if you have hackers in your list. My opponent will actually also get telemetry as one of his classifieds, and he will do it trivially during the game just by putting a repeater out and then spotlighting in ARO. That's one of the things that you get to enjoy if you just have a little bit of hacking. And so this game, for both players, would actually be a little bit of an InfoWars slap fight, but a slap fight that either player would have been significantly disadvantaged in if they just bought nothing in terms of hacking. Now, in terms of deployment, the Gamma and Vidocq team are going to be deploying down here in the bottom left corner. There are some reasonable fire lanes that I can pursue with the Gamma if I'm moving up and around, but more significantly, in terms of assessing the different objectives that I can get to, one of the things going first in B-Pong that you want to do is find one objective that you can just, an antenna that you can just control for most of the game and just bank those points. And in this particular game, it's going to be this antenna here. Now, it is approachable from both sides. It's not easy to see in this picture, but there's a little garbage bin here highlighted in red that a Silhouette 2 model can vault up onto. But even so, this is a very defensible position for me. By comparison, the topmost antenna is much more defensible for my opponent, so I am not going to attempt to try and control that at any point during the game. We just want to be able to get this every single turn if we can. And so the Gamma and Vidocq team are one of the options we have for securing that position. The roadbot is going to be deployed down behind this building. It's actually, in particular, it's kind of set up as a defensive piece in this particular game. It's Panzerfaust, it's in combat form and it's standing. Its Panzerfaust can kind of see down here if it needs to, or up and along this way if it needs to. I do have hopes of moving it out, but spoiler alert, it's not going to move for the entire game. I'm just always going to end up in a position where there's something else that I'm better positioned to use, and so it's going to be hanging out in the rear with the gear pretty much the entire game. We then have our Ment officer on this rooftop here, our Kappa hacker on this rooftop here. One of the weaknesses of this list is that it cuts anything that's a deployment zone repeater, and so I have to actually kind of forward position my hacker if I want to be able to use it defensively. And so it gets this rooftop a little bit more forward positioned, while the Met agent, who really I do want to keep alive, hangs a bit further back. The Cyber Ghost is going to be on this rooftop alongside the Epsilon, but the Epsilon, to note, is my reserve drop. I will basically always reserve drop the Epsilon in this list just because it is such a good sweeper against ARO, like softer hard ARO elements. Things like total reaction bots, in this case things like helots. Smoke shooting with the Epsilon just stacks much, much higher modifiers than the Gamma just firing a whole ton of dice. And so it is a consistent preferred reserve drop. And when it drops down on this rooftop, it's actually going to have a couple of angles moving up and over this bridge that my opponent won't have seen during his regular deployment. Otherwise, we have just scattered camouflage markers throughout the midfield. The Moonrakers, as usual, are providing their mines. And so from bottom to top, what we have are a Moonraker mine. This is a Mimetism 6 camouflage marker. I've actually deployed the Razor Forward Observer as a marker not in hidden deployment because I want its order on the first turn. We have hidden deployed the other mine layer, the Mine Layer Razor. We then have the Moonraker mine, a Moonraker here, and then the Razor's monofilament mine postured kind of aggressively as I can, guarding this position here. It will detonate at some point during the game, and we'll see how that goes. The Razor itself is on this rooftop. Now, it's got infiltration, but there is a 4-inch exclusion zone in this scenario. I actually really like that as a scenario iteration. It's something that we've only just seen, I think, in this ITS season, where, yeah, there are exclusion zones, but they're very small exclusion zones. And so the Razor is as far forward as it can be, with hopes of launching an attack up this direction. This Razor is positioned to attack down here or down here, potentially. I would really like to make close assaults with these Razors, but the expectation is probably that this Razor will end up on this antenna for much of the game. We will see how that goes. In terms of my opponent's deployment, he has recognized the value of his hacking network in making attacks by things like the Gamma and the Roadbot difficult, and so we have the Fugazi drone bots here and here. They are positioned aggressively, but prone so that it's their repeater areas that are aggressively positioned. We've got Joan and the Helot team kind of hanging out in this area here, relatively nicely deployed, although there's a line that my opponent will have missed. So we have the Helot Red Fury deployed here. It is prone, and it's kind of hoping to just watch these angles. But it will turn out that if I vault up onto this bridge here, I'm able to just barely get plunging fire down over this staircase onto it. We then have the war core hanging out way back here, the rocket helot behind this building, kind of same deal. It's looking really just for long, not, it's not looking for easy to engage from my deployment zone angles. So for example, it can't be seen from any of these rooftops. Anything that wants to engage it really will have to come kind of around into the midfield like this. It's nooked back quite thoroughly behind this building here. Joan herself is nice and safe down here. Now, theoretically, she is at risk from the Cyber Ghost standing and doing a really long-range picture shot, but the Cyber Ghost is only ballistic skill 11, and I know my opponent has chain of command, so I'm not particularly inclined to do that. Now, the Kahu duo are deployed on this rooftop. We actually have probably the first mistake from my opponent in this game, which is that the Kahu flareback is standing. Now, this is something that will come from, like, you just play enough reps with a list, you learn what you can and can't do, what is and isn't good practice. A linked Kahu flareback is, on paper, absolutely a serviceable ARO piece, but it is fragile. In my experience using elements like that, you really don't want to use the Kahu as an ARO element until much later in the game. With this kind of a list, for example, you want to rely much more on your hacking network, your soft, like your close-in defenses, and then the helots as your ARO presences early, and then use the Kahu more as an active turn piece, transitioning into a reactive turn play piece, like only when it's kind of time to do so. The Swiss Guard will be deployed in hidden deployment, hanging out sort of like on this rooftop here, or not quite on the rooftop, but just behind the ladder, ready to move around as it wants. The motorized Bounty Hunter is deployed in the back. It rolled and then re-rolled into a monofilament CCW, so nothing great for it, but it is still an aggressive assault piece. And the Teuton is hanging out just next to the Fugazi drone bomb. The Banshee is off the table, obviously, and the two Fennec Fusiliers are on the same building as the Kahu, just behind out of line of sight, as we see right now. Now, I've got first turn, and we're actually, as a bit of an experiment, just going to jump straight ahead to what the end of the turn looks like and go through everything that's been accomplished. The first thing that I knew I wanted to do is just have my Varangians, who are positioned just throughout the deployment zone, throw some smoke, get smoke down, allow the Epsilon to do smoke shooting, and that is what is going to have happened. I had to reroute a Varangian that was behind this building, kind of to come up and around to hang out with the robot, but he gets smoked down. The smoke will go down not quite underneath the bridge, so it covers basically this much of the bridge's area, and that lets the Epsilon just stand up and go ham. The Epsilon was able to put down the Kahu over here, and that's one of the things where we see, right, yep, okay, cool, this is an example of where you want probably to not put the Kahu on ARO early in the game. Yes, if it had been prone, I wouldn't have had to have engaged it, and I would have had one like more order to spend on other things. But killing the Kahus is very high value in terms of just taking a firepower piece away from PanOceania. It's also just a high value in terms of points. The Epsilon also engages this Helot. Now, it doesn't kill it in its first barrage. The Helot actually makes it save and guts us back into a position where it's in total cover relative to the Epsilon. But I do follow through and get the kill on the war correspondent, and then that's basically all of the orders the Epsilon has to spend because it's a combat group 2 piece, and so it goes prone here. Now, that's going to end up being a mistake, although it's something that would have been fairly difficult for me to recognize kind of at this point in the game. Now, I knew more or less what was in the list I was playing against. I had forgotten about the Banshee, but there were a lot of points that were not visible, and I knew that this list had a Swiss Guard HMG in it. I didn't know where the Swiss Guard HMG was, but the thing about this bridge here is that it's actually kind of exposed. It is completely safe against any firepower coming from any sort of like this part of the table onwards, right? The bottom half of my opponent's table outside, but it is vulnerable to fire from this rooftop here, or potentially from anything coming up and around over here under these positions here. And because of that, and because of the importance of the Epsilon, I actually really should have pulled it back into total cover. This is something I could feasibly have done just as part of the gunfighting that it did, right? As it moved forward, took gunfights, just loop it back so I could end prone over here. I didn't do that. And while that is just like, okay, well, look, that's a small optimization that could have been made in my turn, it's an optimization that would have pretty significant effects once my opponent got their first turn. For now, though, the Epsilon is just going to end up on this bridge, having gotten a couple of kills, more than paid for itself, or just about paid for itself, frankly, which is fantastic. The Gamma and the Vidocq team are then going to move up and around, and they will be spending almost all of the orders in Combat Group 1. their path is actually going to take them all the way up and around here, and we are going to do what I shall call doing an ivory, which is where we engage a healot with a high value piece from out of cover. Now, it was kind of necessary if I wanted to engage, and I wanted to engage this healot over here after it had passed its saves and gutsed against the Epsilon. Now, to do that, I had two options. I could either pull all the way up to here and engage from this corner, which would have me in cover, or I could engage it from all the way back on the table edge, as far back as kind of this position here, which put the healot outside of 24 inches. That gave me better modifiers, even though it does mean I'm not in cover. It puts the healot on a net -3 rather than a net 0. And with the number of dice we were throwing at each other, I did consider that to be worthwhile, but it's just always a colossal risk to engage something like a healot from out of cover. If it just randomly rolls up a pair of crits, the fact that you don't get the cover bonus to your defense rolls just puts you at a much higher risk state than is good to be. I knew I was taking a risk here. I thought, well, I've got the Doctor. As it happened, the Gamma rolling 6 dice on 14s against the healot rolling 5 dice on 8s. The Gamma, I think it took 2 goes, but it did put the healot down. And then as part of the orders that it had left, it just continued a little further around to take a long-range firefight against this Fugazi Dronbot. And again, 6 orders did the trick, put this Fugazi down as well. So that's a total of 4 casualties inflicted on my opponent on turn 1. That's pretty good, frankly. Now, of all of them, only the Kahu is like really high value, and my opponent has plenty of very high value pieces to counterattack with. But that's overall a position I'm pretty happy with. We're going to have enough orders left to pull the Gamma and Vidocq team back. They'll actually do a jump up to get one of the Vidocqs onto the rooftop, and that Vidocq will end up in base contact with this objective here. Excellent. And then I've got a couple of orders left. We just make some small attempts at different things. The first thing that we will attempt to do is have the Cyber Ghost Layer picture down here. That would have been really nice. Does not succeed. That's a thing that will happen on 11s when you don't have link bonuses. But we spend just a few remaining orders moving the War Correspondent up and into base contact with the objective over here. Now, this I think is probably my second mistake of the turn. The basic logic that I was pursuing was, well, look, I at least have to give myself the opportunity to score that 1 point. But in practice, it was always going to be trivial for my opponent to kill a War Correspondent, and if I wanted to make my opponent kill a War Correspondent, I could have put it anywhere and just used it as an ARO piece. There was really no difference between the 2 orders I spent, its irregular and then a regular order, moving it down to here, and just literally putting it on any rooftop where it would be in cover and at longer range. This was frankly kind of a pointless play that, like, oh, I'm going to try and just going to give myself that chance to get that 1 point. No, you are never going to get that 1 point with a War Correspondent. If you want to hold this position, you have to make it absolutely a Fort Kickass. And so my deployment, which I kind of just like, I think my deployment was totally fine, but my deployment was not thinking further ahead. It was just building a reasonable defense. What I could and probably should have done instead, for example, is had things like the Moonraker and its mine both deployed in this position with the intention of moving the Moonraker out and laying a bunch more mines, doing stuff like that, for example, to make intruding into this space more difficult. Now, ultimately, all I'm going to lose is a War Correspondent, which is only 3 points, but I basically did give it up for free, and I could have put it anywhere, and it would have had the same effect in terms of sponging up my opponent's orders. And we can see when we jump ahead to the end of my opponent's first turn, oh look, it's a Teutonic Knight in exactly that position where the War Correspondent used to be. Now, there are a few important things that have happened during my opponent's turn here. One thing to note is that inflicting 4 casualties on a list like this one, like Jordan's list, right? My opponent was not Jordan, my opponent was one of my locals, but that is actually pretty significant. The list does have some impetuous activations that it can make use of, and it's got Joan and it's got some NCOs. Like, it has a little bit of order flexibility, but it also starts with some orders off the table. And 4 orders split across the combat groups is going to actually put some fairly significant limits on how much of a counter-offensive can be launched. Now, because of this scenario, there's not actually a huge demand on my opponent to launch that counter-offensive. What he really needs to do is just get up onto some objectives, start getting that points lead that will carry him into the end of the game. And so the demands on his order pool are ultimately limited, but doing a bunch of damage to a list like this PanOceanian one does actually genuinely matter. And you can take a bunch of pieces off of them under some circumstances early in the game that helps making like dealing with the really elite pieces as they move forward a little bit more manageable. Anyway, so in terms of what has happened, there have been three major lines of aggression from my opponent. Up the midfield, so both of the impetuous pieces, knowing that they were relatively free to advance, have done so. Now, that would actually end up being a mistake in terms of the motorized bounty hunter. It did not need to progress forward. It used its impetuous to come up and around like this. That's just put it in a sitting duck position where it did represent another piece that could have moved forward onto the objective if something had stopped the Teuton. But as it was, there were just not quite enough orders to pull it back to a position of safety, and so it's left sitting here, which is going to result in its death next turn. However, the Teuton, using its impetuous order, is able to push up really aggressively up here. It trivially moves through the war correspondent, engages it. I think it engages it with ballistic skill attacks to begin with, but then just quickly rushes into combat, and a war correspondent is not going to survive that, so the Teuton puts the war core down and seizes this objective, which is going to get 1 point on the board for my opponent. The next thing that will happen is that a Banshee will combat jump down here. Now, I would really love to ARO with the Razor, but the Razor has deployed prone, and so I don't have line of sight. And so the Banshee just whoops down and then just walks onto the objective. It makes a roll to try and nudge 2 inches the beacon, but doesn't succeed. But that's fine. It gets into contact with the beacon, and that's going to score another point for my opponent. So end of this round, the score is going to be 1 point to me, 2 points for my opponent, and that little incremental lead is going to add up over time. The final line of offense for my opponent this turn is that the Swiss Guard is going to reveal itself. And I mentioned previously that leaving the Epsilon on this rooftop here, on this bridge, rather than pulling it back to total cover, was putting it at an unnecessary risk. And that unnecessary risk has materialized here. The Swiss Guard comes up this particular ladder, moves into line of sight of the Epsilon, drops out of camouflage, and surprise attacks it. And although the Epsilon is on paper reasonably well positioned, it's got an MSV2, has mimetism itself, the Swiss Guard is a Swiss Guard. Even firing at me in cover through my mimetism, I'm still being surprised. I roll an 11 and I miss because I'm looking for 10s through surprise attack, and the Swiss Guard hits me like 3 times. I fail 2 saves, and boom, Epsilon goes down. And that is a significant problem because the Epsilon was comfortably my best piece for dealing with the Swiss Guard. The Gamma can throw an awful lot of attacks, but it's throwing them on ballistic skill 8 against the Swiss Guard, whereas the Swiss Guard is firing back on 15s. Now, the Swiss Guard does end up staying standing here. There are just not enough orders for my opponent to get it prone or recamouflaged. I am going to attempt to engage with the Gamma, and I'm not going to have any success. Now, attritionally, at the end of this turn, I'm still reasonably comfortably up. In terms of points killed versus damage sustained, both my opponent and I have lost a relatively high-value gunfighter. That represents a large overall proportion of my gunfighting in my list, but points-wise they're about the same. My opponent has still lost a bunch more order-generating troops. That is significant. So I am up. I go into my second turn with a reasonably ample count of orders to launch a counteroffensive with, but B-Pong is one of those scenarios where the score can just slowly begin to creep away from you, and so I'm very cognizant of that as a risk. Now, the only last thing to note in terms of sort of little utility stuff that has happened, we can also see Fennec Fusilier Hacker has moved forward here, and because he doesn't have a pitcher, he has a fast panda, he's just comfortably dotted his little fast panda into this pocket here, which is going to be very difficult for me to deal with. Projecting a repeater area. He's not quite in repeater area of the Gamma right now, but almost any movement from the Gamma through this space will put me in repeater area. Now, the Gamma is my stealth ops, so I do have stealth on the Gamma, but if I want to take any action with him, I am risking AROs. Now, my turn 2 is a little bit of a cluster, but we are able to more or less stay on the board. And there are a number of things that we're going to attempt over the course of this turn to mixed success. We'll go from the top sort of down and just deal with things one at a time. The first is that this Razor has appeared and moved forward, and it has been in line of sight of the Swiss Guard, but there's not much to be done about that. We're going to move forward standing because we really want to put down this Banshee. We reveal, we distribute our shotgun shots, surprise attack. We've got 3 dice. We put 2 into the Banshee and knock him neatly unconscious. We put 1 into the Swiss Guard, just in the hopes of using surprise attack to stop it from hitting me. Tragically, it does hit me, but I pass my save and then guts prone. That's all that Razor is going to do this turn, but 1 order from hidden to get a kill that was netting my opponent points, that's a good outcome. Everything else that is going to happen kind of in this part of the table, and frankly, it's going to all be a little bit of a mess because we've got this hacker here. Now, we're going to try and do the easy thing first, which is that the Cyber Ghost is going to just sort of like crawl down here out alongside of the Swiss, stand up at the end, fire a pitcher. It will land its second pitcher, thankfully. However, less thankfully, it's going to pop down here and take a killer hacker attack against the Fusilier, and the Fusilier is going to crit it and isolate it. That really, really sucks. And it is going to tremendously complicate the remainder of the turn that I want to play here. Now, it is the nature of the beast. Sometimes enemy hackers will crit you, and when you only have a single KHD, that's just something that you have to wear. But I've got nothing in position to un-isolate. Like, I've got Speedball available, but there is nothing that can swing back easily to ward the Cyber Ghost to de-isolate it. And at this stage, I actually don't really think of trying to engage using my Kappa. So and probably I should have, and we'll actually see that happen by the end of the turn, and instead I just kind of wear it and begin moving the Vidok and the Ment team out. Now this is probably a mistake. What I will end up doing is I will end up activating the Kappa. It will put an Oblivion into the Fennec Fusilier that will isolate it, which will enable me to finish my turn in safety. But as we start moving up and around, I am going to absolutely get the Gamma hacked. It is going to end up getting carbonated. It will fail saves against the Carbonite. I will have to call down a Speedball and use one of the Vidocs. Now, Carbonite rather than Oblivion because the Gamma is a Warhorse, just by the by. And I will have to Speedball to recover the Gamma from the isolated state, so from the carbonated state. I'm going to end up moving the Razor here into base contact with the objective. I'm actually going to succeed my willpower roll. I will get spotlit right as like while this is happening because I'm not going to actually isolate the Fennec until later in the turn when I think to do so. I will get spotlit. That will let my opponent do telemetry. There is that little, oh, if you just have some hacking effect again. But I will succeed in pushing the objective just 2 inches forward. Now that does do something that's quite useful. I'm able to just move it into a position where there is a nook under this building that something can actually be really quite hidden in. Not perfectly hidden, but in cover from basically every angle, and that is where I'm going to eventually put a Vidok by the end of the turn. Now, after the comedy of errors moving this link team up and around, at that point I will eventually go, I can just use my Kappa, and we do eventually isolate the Fennec Fusilier, and then continue on with the Gamma. The Gamma is going to take, I think, 2 face-to-face rolls. It will put down it and the Razor actually collectively will put down the Teutonic Knight that was in this position here. The Razor's boarding shotgun at 0 range band does, I think, the bulk of the work. And then the Gamma will take a bunch of face-to-face rolls with the Swiss Guard. The Swiss Guard can only sort of see under this bridge down to about this point near the tank, but I will take a couple of face-to-face rolls with the Gamma and just completely fail to accomplish anything. I don't take any damage from the Swiss Guard, but I just don't win any face-to-face rolls. Even throwing 6 dice, the Swiss Guard is just like, nah bro, I'm just going to roll a 12 when you didn't crit. And so the loss of the Epsilon is absolutely coming back to haunt me, but I don't throw good money after bad. I take as many fights against the Swiss Guard as I have basically orders to do so, and then we just continue to pull the Vidocs up and around, and one Vidoc ends up in base contact with the objective. So I do finally have a pitcher down. I've not sustained any actual casualties this turn, apart from if you want to count the isolation of the Cyber Ghost. So even though we haven't done a tremendous amount of damage to my opponent, we have still killed 2 models. And that's 2 models for no casualties other than the use of our Speedball. So this is overall, again, kind of a good turn. But I am not really aggressively pinning anything back here. Joan is still able to activate in advance. The Swiss Guard is still able to activate in advance. The saving grace that I have is that the order pools my opponent has to do anything with are beginning to run out. We've both done 1 classified. I have kept my opponent off of this objective. I'm still reasonably secured up here, but that is going to change as the heavy hitters my opponent has, even with a limited order pool, begin to move out. And it is on this turn, we're looking at the end of my opponent's turn 2 here, that my casualties do finally begin to mount. Now, the first thing that's going to happen is that the Fennec is going to just pop up onto this corner. He is going to, I think, survive getting shot by basically anything, because he's just using his isolated order. He will get spotlit, which will give me telemetry, but he will put down the repeater. The Swiss Guard, actually it's the Swiss Guard that goes first when we're talking about. The Swiss Guard is going to move up and around, get line of sight to the Gamma, engage the Gamma, and it takes only 2 orders for the Swiss Guard to put the Gamma into no wound incapacitation state. The first face-to-face roll, the Swiss Guard hits I think 3 times. The Gamma is however very tough, passes all 3 saves, but the second face-to-face roll, the Swiss Guard crits and hits again, 3 more saves, and this time I failed 2 of them and just guts prone. We're not having that fight anymore. The Swiss Guard is a far superior gunfighter under these circumstances, and I need the Gamma alive. With the Gamma going down, the Fennec is then able to move up and kill my repeater over here, and that gives Joan a nice clear run, which she takes full advantage of. I think she just spends her LT order as part of this. I'm pretty sure at some point in the previous turn I was able to kill the last of the helots, but she is very fast, she has her LT order, and she just moves up and around here. She's going to vault up onto this garbage bin and then up and around, and she's pretty safe to do that. She does have to avoid Panzerfaust fire. She has to be prone for a little bit of this because there is the risk of the Panzerfaust from the roadbot over here, but having done that, prones up and around. She takes a face-to-face roll. She's not quite able to get in to the Razor initially. She's going to take a face-to-face roll, and the Razor on this rooftop actually wins the face-to-face roll, not hugely surprisingly, and boarding shotguns her. I think I passed my save against the Pulsars, but then she moves into combat, and at that point the Razor is thoroughly dead, and she cuts the Razor to pieces. Now, that's bad news because that puts Joan on this objective, and as part of this movement, as she's cut up through this direction here, she's fired her Spitfire into my Vidocq. Now, my Vidocq was in cover, but that still just means she's 4 dice on 12s. I think I fired back with my shotgun, and to no effect. She hit 3 times. She put the Vidocq all the way to dead. And so even though the Pan-Oceanian force is not able to get anything onto the central objective this turn, Joan is able to get onto this button here. And that is a concern because that puts the score at 3-1 my opponent's way. Now, not the end of the world. My opponent has had to hemorrhage points and spend a lot of orders to get there, but that is not the kind of lead that you want to be going into the final round in B-Pong against. Another thing to note is that you will observe the Swiss Guard has moved. To get the face-to-face roll with the Gamma, it had to jump down and then move across this direction, but it is currently sitting in cover behind a little obstacle in this just behind this building here. Now, we have a lot of work to do if we want to be able to hope to secure a win in this scenario. Now, there are a few things that we can accomplish, but there are going to be a series of Hail Marys here. Actually in a very particular order, because we really can only take a certain number of these fights at the same time. The first thing that's going to happen this turn is that the Razor that was hanging out prone here is going to recamouflage itself, come down and around here. It's actually going to have, no, there's going to be smoke. Yeah, there are a number of like really close run things here. So the Varangian on the upper flank, on my left flank, is going to impetuous up. It's going to survive a face-to-face roll in its impetuous phase against the Swiss Guard and get some smoke down. It's just going to get some smoke down like around here. It'll have to spend a regular order to do so after it's impetuous, but it'll move. We can actually see the Varangian has ended up in this position over here. It's going to be moving across this rooftop, surviving face-to-face rolls, throwing smoke down here, and then ending up prone on this rooftop. That is significant because it's in zone of control of my opponent's HVT, and that will let me secure the HVT. My own HVT is hanging out back here at the very top of the table. That's going to be very significant because every point that you can get at this juncture in the game is very relevant. So smoke goes down over here, and I secure the HVT with the Varangian. It will stay there for the rest of the game. That allows the Razor to move up, end up prone behind this roof, this barricade here, peek out, not to see the Swiss Guard, and then lay a monofilament mine. The Razor then runs around the mine, careful not to block its detonation, into cover here. It sees the Swiss along the entire path, and because if the Swiss does anything other than dodge, it will eat a monofilament mine, the Swiss Guard declares dodge. It fails its dodge, but passes its save against the monofilament mine. However, in much happier news, that is a Razor that has the Swiss Guard out of cover, and it is packing a burst 3 boarding shotgun. It's in +6 range, which means it's hitting 3 dice on 12s. It hits and crits, and of the 3 saves that the Swiss Guard has to take, it fails 2 of them and goes unconscious. That is really significant, and also, I will say, testament to the strength of what some stuff like these Razor units can accomplish. The Razor is then going to pull all the way back. It will lay a mine as it goes, and it basically is going to set up a defensive cordon around this objective. I don't want anything getting to this objective. I will be on this objective myself, and I will leave a monofilament mine in the path of advance of any of the few remaining resources that my opponent might try and bring to bear against this objective. That's all gone quite well. Okay, the Gamma is then going to hop up onto these, come up these stairs, around and see Joan. It's got its heavy pistol. She is wounded, and after I think 3 face-to-face rolls of her trying to dodge into close combat, and the Gamma just winning face-to-face rolls needing 17s, he puts Joan down. He does not have enough orders to get onto this objective, although you can only score 1 objective each round in any case, but her going down is significant. The only thing I have any orders left to do are to have the Vidocq as part of the Gamma moving. The Vidocq that was in the fire team with it is going to end up touching the objective and prone. And then finally, the one irregular isolated order I have is spent just having the Cyber Ghost vault up onto this truck. Now, the Cyber Ghost is ballistic skill 11. I'm not expecting it to do anything great, but I otherwise would have no use for that order. Nothing else can spend it. And on turns like this, that can have an impact in the game. It's one of those play your outs things where if you have an isolated model at the end of the game, you may as well, in fact, many cases, models that you have at the end of the game, you're going first in your final round, unless there's something important relating to kill points in terms of the scenario, it is often worth your time putting as many things on ARO as you can if you have the orders to do so, because those pieces are all of no further value to you. And the decision to do so with the Cyber Ghost was just kind of like a subconscious little optimization. I had the order, may as well spend it, pop up onto this position to take some ARO pieces. This is going to end up actually being possibly one of the most significant decisions in the game. And the reason for that is that from this position here, my opponent actually has relatively few outs. They have basically one thing they have to accomplish. Now the score is 3-1 my opponent's way. However, at the end of the game, I'm going to get 1 point from securing the HVT. If he does not dislodge the Razor, I'm going to get 1 point from this antenna. I'm going to get 1 point from controlling the B-Pong, and I'm going to get 2 more points from having the B-Pong in my opponent's half of the table because I shoved it forward the previous turn. That's going to take me from 1 point up to 6 points, but 3 of those points are contingent on the B-Pong not moving. And so moving the B-Pong is what my opponent has to do, but he doesn't have very many orders left to do it with. His force is pretty much shredded. All that's left is like 1 Fugazi, the Magistrate, and a single Kahu on this rooftop. I think there's one other thing hanging around somewhere as well. And so while he isn't in retreat, because there's no retreat in this scenario, the groups are discombobulated. He really has very, very few orders with which to accomplish things. So what he's going to do is he's going to end up consolidating very slightly. He's got just 1 command token left at this point, so that the Kahu has a couple of orders to spend. It's going to have the NCO order and then 2 regular orders. There is a single order left in the other combat group, which is just the Magistrate Chain of Command. It is just going to run out and take a gunfight with the Razor in the hopes of killing the Razor and preventing me from getting this point here. It will not succeed the face-to-face roll. It will detonate the monofilament mine. It will pass its save against the monofilament mine. But it will go down to the shotgun from the Razor, although that doesn't really matter, it's the only order that it had. The Kahu then has 3 orders, and 3 orders is few. It has to get down off of this rooftop, get up to the B-Pong, and then not make a roll, because you don't need to make a roll with the specialist, but you need to get in base contact with the B-Pong, and yeet the B-Pong 4 inches towards my half of the table. Now, I have only moved it 2 inches. 4 inches should get it all the way back into my part of the table, and that will change it from me getting 3 points, right? 2 points for having the Pong in my opponent's part of the table, 1 point for touching it, to my opponent getting 2 points. Since my opponent has 2 points already, sorry, 3 points already, because they've done a classified, that will put them on 5 to my 4, even if everything else goes well, and it will win my opponent the game. The Kahu's going to come down here, move up and around. It will take face-to-face rolls. It will fire off its Blitzen actually at the Gamma, just to take a face-to-face roll. It will win the face-to-face roll, but the Gamma will pass both of his saves. And then it will move up again, getting almost in range of the objective, but not quite. The Gamma will fire, the Gamma will miss. It will fire its Blitzen back at the Gamma, this time isolate, or this time immobilizing the Gamma, but leaving the Cyber Ghost unopposed. This range is within 36 inches, the Cyber Ghost rolls, the Cyber Ghost hits, and the Kahu fails its save and goes down. And that roll, that combi rifle at 20-something inches against the model out of cover but with mimetism, wins me the game. because with the Kahu going unconscious, there are no orders left to recover it. There is nothing that can be done. Every order was needed to get the Kahu up to this thing. The Kahu had to just weather those face-to-face rolls. This combi rifle means that the Kahu goes down, and because the Kahu goes down, it's not able to huck the B-Pong back into my half of the table, and that means that the game ends 6 points to 3 my way. But it was within an absolute inch, literally, the Kahu got within 1 inch of this button and needed the one more order in order to push forward, got within an absolute inch of victory for the PanOceanian list. And I think, frankly, that is credit both to my opponent who played this quite well, but this was my opponent's first game with this list. We can point out some flaws, some mistakes, some things that they should have done differently. Those are absolutely things that you will run into the first time you try something out, particularly if it's a list that you are just picking up from someone else and trying. Right, my opponent played it quite well, but there would absolutely be optimizations that they could make if they played it a few more times. I think, given how close that this game came, even with frankly, some real stomping that I was able to put into the PanOceania list over the course of the game, the fact that it still came so close, it's such a depth of power in the list. There were so many different offensive angles that it could push. This list is a goer. This list is really, really good. Credit to Jordan for the development time that he put into this list and the work that he put into learning how to play it. I think his win at Border Bash, which is a 5-round tournament, was entirely well deserved, so well done, mate. And this list you've made is a killer. It was my pleasure to play against it. A very challenging game, very interesting game, and overall a fantastic experience. Now, as for the razors, well, we managed to detonate 2 monofilament mines this game, which is more than we've done in previous. However, as tends to be the case, my opponent made all of their saves against the monofil mines. So, that's fine, you gotta keep on pushing. 80% of gamblers give up right before they hit big. But we did get to see the strength of those +1 burst boarding shotguns. Wounding a Teuton, taking down the Banshee, taking down the Swiss Guard. There are not many things in the game, even closing into close range, that can threaten a Swiss Guard thanks to its armor and its mimetism and its high ballistic skill. And the fact that a Razor was able to is like, okay, cool. Yep, these pieces have some legs. They are not too aggressively costed, like 27 and 31 points, I think, for the 2 different Razors. Given what you get, that's extremely worthwhile, and I will be continuing to play with them in O-12. Now, that wraps up today's battle report. Just as the usual quick plug, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. Now, I'm a bit under the weather this week, as you can probably tell from my voice, come down with something over the last couple of days. But this was a sufficiently interesting game that I absolutely wanted to get a battle report out for it. Next week, I'm hoping to do another faction focus, or maybe a little event report, as we have a 3-round local event coming up, which I am running, but I may get a chance to play in. Either way, we will be back as usual next week. And in the meantime, as always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.